Our next speaker is Marc Levitan. He's with the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and as Tanya alluded to, he's done a lot of work in recent years on the impacts from the Joplin tornado. And so if you'll take a moment to introduce yourself, and yeah, thank you.
I'm part of the Texas Tech alumni group here that we have today. Chris and Tanya, maybe a few others in the room here. Good school to go to for wind engineering. Yeah, my background, I was at LSU for 20 years on the faculty of civil engineering, and founded and ran the Hurricane Center there. And about 4.5 years ago, moved up to NIST, to lead NIST's National Institute of Standards and Technology, part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, to lead their efforts under the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program. And right after I arrived, just a few months after I arrived, the Joplin tornado occurred, and so that was, we spent nearly 3 years doing a significant technical investigation of that, and I'm going to give you just a few slides about what we did there, and then focus on what are we doing towards implementing the recommendations. So I'm not going to get too much into the damage Tanya said, but what the results of what all that damage was, and why are we going to, what changes we're making in code standards and practice. Just a few second recap. So this was rated in the EF5, so estimated by the Weather Service maximum wind speeds exceeded 200 miles per hour. Went right through 6 miles, a mile wide, 6 miles right through the middle of Joplin. The tornado was longer, but in the beginning and end it didn't hit that much. Almost 8,000 buildings damaged or destroyed. Lifeline systems, the costliest storm, nearly $3 billion as a single tornado event. 161 fatalities, over 1,000 injuries. This one tornado exceeds the average death toll in tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes combined in the U.S. just from this one event. Key questions to really ask is, okay, I mean, there's a lot of tornadoes per year, but what are things that we're going to try and do to study? Because this mission, and it may be different, I know you all know FEMA goes out and studies, they develop mitigation assessment team reports after events, and kind of their job is to say, hey, what's the best we can do in 5 or 6 month time frame? What lessons can we learn? Let's get something published quickly that's going to help with the rebuilding. And we also go out and study, sometimes the same events, and we take a longer term view as digging much deeper into the science and the engineering behind it to develop the technical basis for improvements to national code standards and practice. So we work very closely with FEMA, coordinate and collaborate with them. And so sometimes maybe we say, well, why are you both doing a study on the same event? We do it for different purposes. So how effective, we were interested, particularly some of the key questions, how effective was our warning system and practices, and can building safety in tornadoes be enhanced, recognizing the codes don't really currently address that. Our specific goals, we're investigating the wind environment and the conditions associated with all these fatalities and injuries, performance of emergency communications, so we're not just looking at the buildings, the public response to communications, performance of residential, commercial, and critical buildings, designated safe areas, all these affect life safety. With the idea behind that, what was the purpose of this? So we wanted to use this information to develop the basis for findings and recommendations that can lead to improvements in requirements for design and construction of buildings. Really somewhat unique in that it was the first study to really bring together study of the storm characteristics, the building performance, emergency communications, human behavior, and how each of those interacted with life safety and contributions of each of those to injury and death. So we ended up with 16 recommendations broadly for improving work that we need to do to improve tornado hazard characterizations, improve building and shelter design and construction for tornado-prone regions, and emergency communications. So now I'm going to go through briefly a few of the highlights of the recommendations and what progress we're making on implementing those. probably our cornerstone recommendation is that we recommend development of nationally accepted performance-based standards for tornado-resistant design of buildings and infrastructure. And I guess the question is it any surprise that we have all this damage and destruction and death from tornadoes? Because tornadoes aren't part of the building code. Unless you're building a safety-related structure at a nuclear power plant, or unless you're building a tornado shelter or a safe room, the word tornado doesn't appear in the building code. It doesn't appear in our design standards, so we shouldn't really be surprised, and we need to start considering it. And when we talk about this is sort of a conceptual idea, borrowing from how things are done in seismic, performance-based design for different type of structures, critical facilities down to more modest type of buildings. You need to start thinking about picking what performance level do you want, and it could either be at what EF scale, it could be at different return periods associated here, but different wind speeds, probabilistic wind speeds, but you need to start thinking about what level of performance do we want out of different buildings. And by the way, this type of performance-based design, we need to move for that for all wind hazards, not just tornado, but this is what we're focusing on right here. So progress on implementation. So we published our report a little more than a year ago. We're working right now towards making changes in all of these various standards, codes, and guidelines that are listed up here. We have a significant effort where we hope to have a totally separate chapter for tornado design in ASCE 7. That's our national standard for loads on buildings. The ICC 500, the 2018 or 19, the next edition of storm shelters, we want to explicitly be able to address a retrofit of buildings for that, which we don't address now. We've actually we're working with a couple of new standards. We worked one on estimation of wind speeds in tornadoes through ASCE, working with NFPA on some things about safety and sheltering for a new standard they have here. We've got some code changes that we'll see, and I'll brief you a little bit more on each one of these. Some code changes in for the 2018 IBC to enhance requirements for storm shelters, and some guidance documents here. One of them actually is already published, and we'll go through those a little bit more detail. One of them, and so I'm not hitting all our recommendations, just giving you some highlights here, but one of our recommendations technology beyond the EF scale. How do you measure wind speed estimates using radar, using forensic engineering, and other tools to be able to record all that data. So also data archival is a key part of that. So the scope of the standard includes all of these various areas. We've just got started this past spring, got another meeting coming up in the fall. Recommendation number 3 from this is to develop tornado hazard maps for use in engineering design of buildings. Project to reanalyze the entire NOAA tornado database, account for some of the biases in there, analyze what we're learning from the radar data, from these mobile radars that go out and study the tornadoes. What do we learn about more of the detailed structure of the wind field? And so sort of using a state of the science review and take all of that information over the course of the next few years to develop much better tornado hazard maps. And I'll tell you right now, even though the point probability, as we know, of a tornado hitting an individual structure is low, the likely that the probabilities that we're going to find are going to be several times larger than than existing maps have accounted for. All the biases that we're finding population bias, tornado measurement bias, observation bias, etc. They're all on the low side. And so everything that we have is unconservative. Recommendation number 5, this is this one of developing a nationally accepted performance-based design standard. A new an ad hoc technical committee on performance-based design for extreme winds, which includes a thrust in tornadoes. So this will hopefully be available, and we'll have a new chapter on tornado design in ASCE 722, making use of the maps that are being developed as a result of that previous recommendation. Storm shelters. So one of the things right now, I chaired a committee of ICC and NSSA, which developed the original storm shelter standard in 2008. We just published an edition in 2014, but that's almost completely irrelevant for new construction. It doesn't really cover retrofit. Well, we've got millions and millions of buildings and areas, and so retrofit is always going to be much more difficult, but particularly sometimes schools, they're landlocked. They just can't build a new building, and so how can we reinforce that? So we have an agreement from ICC in the next edition, whether it's 2018 or 19, to expand the scope of that to include retrofit as well. We've developed and submitted some code change proposals for the 2018 IDC that basically will require that new buildings on existing school campuses, or if you got a school campus, you're building a new building, or you're building a new wing on a building, that basically, if you don't already have a storm shelter that's big enough to hold everybody on the campus, your new building is going to have it if it has enough square footage. The intent is, if you're going to build a couple hundred square foot addition for a music study room or something, and you got a 2,000 person high school, we're not going to say you all of a sudden have to turn that into a $2 million project. But if you're putting in a new gymnasium and you got enough square footage, then you're going to make that big enough to shelter everybody on that campus. Working with FEMA in the new update, which just recently published of FEMA 361, that's guidance for safe rooms and tornadoes, we'll work to address our recommendation number 8, which will recommend development and implementation of guidelines to enable communities to create safe and effective public sheltering strategies. So this has more to do with placement of shelters in communities, some of the issues that were talked about on Tuesday. I don't want to open my shelter because maybe we're mixing people and students, or maybe the shelter doesn't get open on the tornado, so I don't want to open it to the public, and all these kind of things. Well, we worked with FEMA to be able to put some of this kind of information and some guidance into this FEMA 361 document. We're also working as a brand new NFPA standard under development called the NFPA 1616, Standard on Mass Evacuation and Sheltering. And we're working to try and address multiple hazards and building safety. The first draft that came out of this document, with public comment draft in December, or last fall, it had all kinds of great information about selecting buildings for sheltering based on how many bathrooms and food service capabilities and being able to manage. It didn't say one word about picking a safe building. And so we're working with that committee to get that incorporated into the new one. Another real exciting one is, what about the many, many millions of buildings that we have that don't have shelters or aren't going to get them anytime soon? FEMA has an existing document called Tornado Protection, How Do You Select Best Available Refuge Areas Within Existing Buildings. I noticed that there's a refuge area here that they have a sign kind of in the middle of the building. You don't know what process was used to identify that. It was farthest away from the walls, whatever. And this document that FEMA has right now is pretty anecdotal, empirical. And so we're working, actually FEMA is funding, we're working very closely with FEMA on a new publication that's going to have a much more engineering-based selection methodology based on building fragilities and types and characteristics. And that's maybe a year or two down the road before that's coming out. But that'll be a great assistance for all of the myriad number of buildings that don't have shelters or can't get them anytime soon. So all of these things, like I said, are kind of in the context of what I mentioned before. Our current national code standards and practices, they're really focused on life safety for the hazards that are considered. But tornadoes are not a considered hazard. And so the good news is we're really, we're seeing a change. There's a paradigm shift, and it's palpable. We can see it. It's currently underway right now. Engineers, owners, architects, building owners, and operators, they're beginning to understand that tornado, it's not just an act of God. It's not something you just can't do anything about. We can start to do things about this. I don't know how many calls I've gotten from architects, engineers, hospital operators, or whatever. They saw what happened in Joplin, and they also saw that articles about what the hospital in Joplin was doing in its rebuilding. And said, wait a minute, we can do that. And they said it cost less than 1%. They've done significant hardening and protection of things, less than 1% cost increment. So while the probability of a tornado strike of any individual building is low, the probability of a tornado impacting a community tornadoes are orders of magnitude larger, and what we've seen here, it's also about communities, not individual buildings. So the exciting thing, some of these changes are already occurring. The 2015 International Building Code, just starting to be adopted, and this is a code change put in a couple of years ago by FEMA. It's going to now require storm shelters in schools, critical facility operations centers, 911 call centers in areas having a tornado design speed greater than 250. Well, that's Tornado Alley and Dixie Alley. That's this dark gray region in the middle here. So you're building a new school project. If your community has or state has adopted IBC 2015, all of a sudden, hey, I got to put in a storm shelter. Okay. And like I said, we have changes proposed for the 2018 IBC and the International Existing Building Code that would expand this to not just greenfield school projects. I mean, how many new schools do we build versus putting an addition on or putting a new building on the school? So this is going to get us many more shelters. And this is also going to include multi-purpose. A lot of times in schools nowadays, the gym might be a multi-purpose community building center. I mean, the kids use it during the day and other people use it at night, and that might not be a Group E. The building official might not decide that's a Group E assembly, and that might not be covered even under this existing requirement. So that's going to be assembly occupancies are going to be included there. The state of Alabama, after the Enterprise tornado several years ago, began requiring ICC 500 shelters in schools statewide, and 2 years later they passed requirements for shelters to be installed at college campuses. Illinois, just last year, passed statewide requirements for ICC 500 shelters. And many of these shelters, including in Joplin and their rebuilding, they're now being designed to accommodate nearby residents and be available to the community 24/7. In Joplin, if a watch is issued, not even a warning, a watch is issued, they automatically unlock the doors to the shelter. They move, the way they have it designed, they can accommodate the residents, people from the area, in a separate area from where the students would be, and people can come in. So 24/7, doesn't matter if school's in session. So we get a significant public investment building these shelters, and we got to figure out how to be able to use those. And communities are doing that now. More Oklahoma, we've heard, they've recently adopted some new residential building code provisions to get something nominally equivalent to like a 135 mile per hour design wind speed, which would get us some significant tornado resistance. Like I said, the hospitals, other hospitals are starting to do, consider doing what the St. John's in Joplin has done. And also, not just in structural engineering, changes are happening. Some of the area communities, I really cut out most of the things on communication out of this talk. One of the problems in Joplin is they blew the siren twice. And some people thought the second siren was an all clear, because in some communities they blow the siren as an all clear. Well, then they blew it again because there was another warning that was issued, and they actually spotted the thing on the ground, and there's a lot of confusion, and there is no national standard for that. And so what happens, even some of the area communities are trying to develop regional standards. So you go from one town to the next, if the sort of siren sounds, or it sounds again, or how long does it sound, at least it's going to mean the same thing. And so I think we've really reached this sort of a paradigm shift. Things are changing on the ground, and I've just kind of given you kind of a summary of what some of the things that NIST is doing to help move this along. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes. I've left some cards up on the front here, though. If anybody's got any questions or wants a copy of the Joplin report or the CD or anything like that, you can come up and grab one of those cards afterwards.
Do you have time for one or two questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and take one or two questions for Mark before he has to leave.
Is the Joplin report online?
Yes.
Do you think there's enough political will to get more shelters in mobile home parks and areas with lots of mobile homes?
I might just defer that question to someone who works more in that area. I can talk about the technical requirements, but I certainly hope so. It's really, really needed. As it turns out, strangely, there wasn't a single manufactured home that was hit in Joplin, just due to the nature of that community and where it went. But certainly, in general, those homes are more vulnerable because they don't have as much strength as even regular stick-built, site-built homes. It's really needed.
But it really didn't matter in Joplin. It took everything.
Well, a lot of buildings were completely damaged. But half of the 8,000 buildings had a lot of damage, but they weren't gone, right? And so that's the other thing, and like with this more, with other ones, if we can build them a little bit better, we're not necessarily talking about building everything's bunkers, and maybe we can take the ones that had modest damage, and maybe those are not damaged at all, and the ones that were completely leveled, maybe those have at least some parts of the building that survive, even if they didn't have a shelter inside, if you've tied them together with some hurricane clips and other things that are relatively lower cost. Again, the direct hit by the EF5, that's going to take more than that, but even fairly modest changes are going to get you a lot and shrink the pattern of damage all across the range of wind speeds that we have across the tornado. Because of course, an EF4 or 5, only a few percentage of the total amount of the damage area has EF4 or 5 damage. It's 3, 5, 7%, 10%, 15%. The rest of it sort of gradiates out as you move away. And so most of the area, even in an EF4 or 5 tornado, only sees EF1 or 2 winds. Most of the area that's impacted.
One other question. More Oklahoma. Is their code anything like
what Joplin developed, or?
No, Joplin has not made, to my knowledge, not made any significant changes to their building codes post-storm, but more has. Okay. Now, having said that, though, Joplin, and I've studied more in hurricane country, but some tornadoes, a lot of years and a lot of damage investigations over the years. Especially for a town its size, Joplin had an excellent job. They had records going back to the 1800s of code adoption and enforcement. They were always adopting the latest model codes, and from what we could tell, they had good adoption and enforcement of the national model codes. The problem is the national model codes let them down because they don't say the word tornado, and we haven't thought about that, and hopefully we're going to be changing that.
Mark, has NIST worked at all with the Weather Service on finding the optimal length for lead time for a tornado warning? In the El Reno event, you had a very long lead time to send this tornado warning. People got in their cars and took off, and it creates a more hazardous situation to have people in their cars. I wonder if you talked about that at all.
Not on specifically on trying to look at what is an optimal lead time. One of our recommendations, I didn't show it here, was, which is really something that the Weather Service, and again, one of our authors was from NOAA Severe Storms Laboratory, is to develop probabilistic to our polygon system, but still, it's still a binary system. You're either in a polygon, which means you have a warning, or you're not in a polygon and you're out of the warned area. But if you're, in the center of that polygon where the storm is, you might have 80 or 90% likelihood that the tornado is going to hit you there, versus if you're in some far corner of that polygon, you might have 2%. And so, to be able to develop this gridded probabilistic forecast information, which then broadcast media can use to develop more meaningful guidance. And with everybody's got smartphones now and applications on smartphones, you'll be able to, again, help people to understand what their risk is even within that area. But in terms of understanding if there's some optimal time, or if they think there's going to be a warning and not giving it out because there's too much time, whatever. No, I think that the real answer, I think the real answer there is on the community guidance, on training and educating people what they're supposed to be doing in the different situations, and then having an infrastructure with shelters and identified refuge areas that's going to support that, so people can make the best decision that they can. But yeah, certainly getting in your car, getting stuck in traffic is never going to be a good decision.
I can speak just a little bit to the optimal lead time. A study was done a couple of years ago that a student of mine worked on. It's actually, there's an article in Weather, Climate, and Society, the AMS journal. I'm Rachel Riley, and I work at the University of Oklahoma. And so the author is Stephanie Hoekstra, and I think it was in 2011. And it was kind of just, a pilot study, but I'd have to look back at the article to remember the exact time frame, but I know that, I think it was around 30 minutes. It was people, listed their preferred lead time. And once you got beyond that, then, they spend more time. They might drive away or, do other things and take an action. So I think it's something that researchers are looking at, though.
Let me just follow up before you do it. I think we would want to be cautioned that we wouldn't want to use that to say, hey, we don't need more lead time.
Right.
Because if we can get to the point where we consistently have more lead time, that opens up a different universe of possibilities for us to think about and educate and develop in the planning. And community tornado shelters become a more broadly acceptable. Right now, there's a lot of situations where they really wouldn't be applicable in communities and based on traffic and other things and population. But if we can get to consistently longer lead times, that does open up different options that we can use, particularly related to community sheltering.
One last point. I know too that lives saved with each minute that you get increases in about 15 minutes. I think that sort of flatlines a little bit. But every minute counts up to this 15 for sure.